Heedless of the reactions around him, the man's intense focus remained fixed on the floor as he lost himself in thought. The chief's response to objections was blunt. "It is inadvisable to challenge my desire to write in wine. Who knows, perhaps I will crave the use of blood instead. Bring me the Vadmal and Thrall so we can proceed." Aldrich couldn't help but wonder if any monk had ever begun such a holy task amidst such unholy surroundings. The festive table served as a desk, and a wine cup served as an inkwell. The rowdy crowd around the room drank, sang and played games, while Lodin wrestled with a full-grown bear cub in the corner. The walls displayed gruesome reminders of past hunts, making the space seem more like a shrine to savagery. The warrior scribe wrote slowly and with difficulty, attempting to capture snippets of Hedwig's conversation across the room. His sentences came out twisted, but he still managed to write. Painstakingly, he recorded his fleeting thoughts on parchment with purple and white ink. No longer did anyone need to tax their memory for mundane details like the location of the tallest trees along the riverbanks. The small foxhair brush took care of that. The chief took pleasure in dictating, reveling in the act as if starved for it. He hung over it like a drunkard over his drink, barely able to control himself. Ironbeard made a fuss as he left for the other house, and Weibrand noisily replaced the torches on the walls, yet the chief's monotonous dictation never wavered. One by one the men around Tove fell asleep, snoring loudly, and he paid no attention to it, just as he ignored the sound of the wind whispering through the grove. Eventually the torches too fell asleep, spluttering in frustration, and the fire, which had been lazily flickering, tiredly closed its last ember and drifted off into a deep slumber. Reluctantly, Tove sat up, stretching his arms above his head and sighing regretfully. "My mind resists leaving that place, just as stubbornly as Sigmund's sword was wedged in the tree trunk. We will return to our work first thing in the morning. You have done me a great service, one that I will never forget as long as I live." He leaned back against the bearskin, stretching his arms once more and yawning. After a moment of contemplation, he added thoughtfully, "Your accomplishments have remedied a misfortune of mine from last winter, when I was forced to kill a youth who was of great value to me." The scribe sat with his legs stretched out in front of him, his fingers working to relieve the cramped ache in his hand, caught in a weariness-induced stupor. Suddenly he awoke and, in the flickering light of the only remaining torch, shot a quick glance at the chief's face. After a while he spoke casually. "Forced, chief? How did that come about? Could his value not have outweighed his crime?" Suppressing a yawn, Tove stood up and looked down at his follower as he did up his cloak. "Yes," he said slowly, "perhaps his value could have outweighed his crime, but not his deceit. It was not only because he broke my strictest orders that I killed him, but because he pretended to be loyal to me while secretly plotting against me. He and his impulsive friend, Magnus Sverrir, aimed to understand me and manipulate me as you manipulate your writing brush there. Can you imagine how a man would feel after being tricked by a couple of boys?" The Norman sat for a long time, gazing at a massive hairy pelt that hung on the wall in front of him. It shuddered occasionally in the breeze, and when the light flickered over it, it seemed like a shapeless creature poised to pounce from the shadows. After a while he laughed bitterly. If he possessed the naivete to presume that he could engage in deceit and elude detection, then he reaped the consequences of his own foolishness. He spoke with a bitter tone. His posture became rigid, and he inhaled deeply in preparation for further discourse. However, the leader departed from the enclosure. The southerner watched him exit, while stifled chuckles emanated from the nook where Kark slumbered. Aldrich pivoted toward the sound, but before he could advance, Hala's appendage extended from his sleeping quarters and clasped his colleague's waistband with firmness. "It is not essential to sully your hands with the blood of a reptile at this juncture," he said gently. "In addition to venomous fangs, the thrall also possesses the guilefulness of a serpent in his loathsome cerebrum. He comprehends that Tove shall not, for any justification that could be uttered, harm the individual responsible for transcribing his chronicle. Wait until the archival documentation has culminated, then it will be an appropriate moment to act." He guided his fellow warrior downward onto the bunk adjacent to him, and maintained his grip until the slumber of utter fatigue had claimed him. Chapter 28. Things that are fated. The tree fades away that stands in the enclosure. Neither bark nor leaves guard it. So is a man whom no one loves. Why should he stay long? In a chain of lengthening days and softening nights, spring arrived. The instinct that draws animals out of their dens to roam in the sunlight awoke in the Norsemen's hearts, and made them restless amid plenty. The instinct that drives birds to build nests amid the young green led the Vikings' hearts toward their ice-bound homes. With joyful acclaim, they cheered Tov's decree from beneath the budding maple tree. In 4 weeks, if the season continues in this manner, it is likely that the pack ice around the mouth of Eric's fjord will be broken enough to let us through. 4 weeks from today, God willing, we will set sail for Greenland. The encampment entered into a period of restless activity. Carpenters set to refitting the ship until all the silent bay echoed with their pounding. With endless labor, the great logs were floated down the river and hauled on board. Porters trudged to and fro with bags of grain and barrels of wine. The whirring of the packers in the storehouses over the rich fruit sounded like a swarm of bees. Kark, the indolent, also joined in, clanging pots and kettles with joyful energy. "Only a little more time until the death wolf claims his due," he sang over his work. "Only a little more time until the death wolf claims his due." On the morning of the last day in Vinland, Robert the Norman penned the final word in the bizarre exploration journal and laid down his brush forever. "That's the end of it, Chief," he said slowly. They sat in the larger of the sleeping houses as they had sat on that December night when the work began. Now the sun sent a flood of yellow light through the open doorway, and a pink flowering bush pressed its sweet face towards the window. Tove looked at him with dull, distant eyes. "Yes, it has ended," he said reluctantly, and he was silent for such a long time that the young man raised his head with surprise. An odd expression of something akin to regret washed across the chief's face. When he met his companion's gaze, he let out a short, harsh laugh that was full of more scorn than mirth. "It is finished," he repeated, "and though I cannot comprehend why I am acting so foolishly, I feel a great mourning within me. Something cherished has left my life." He fell into a contemplative silence, only gesturing toward the door when he emerged. "There is no logic behind this," he growled, "but I am at the mercy of this mood. I have no inclination to converse about anything. We will discuss your reward tonight. Leave now and spend the remainder of the day as you please." He did not look up as his associate complied. He remained seated over a substantial white roll, as if it were a corpse of a beloved companion. Outside, in the cheer of spring sunshine, the men congregated in small clusters, devising lively activities for the day. All preparation for departure was accomplished, leaving behind a day to be experienced without restraint. Which pastime is ever so tiresome that the knowledge of it being the last time does not induce delight? They impishly sharpened their knives, enjoying friendly competition with one another. Halla's boisterous exhortations to a wrestling match rose the highest over the laughter and taunting, yet no one accepted the challenge. As the Norman walked out of the cabin, the wrestler ceased his enticements and approached his comrade with an amiable grin. "I commend Tove," he proclaimed heartily, "for recognizing that the last day in a place like Vinland the Good is far too valuable to squander on onerous duties. Magnus will grumble that he did not wait longer for your arrival." Disappointment pinched the Norman's face. "Where has Magnus departed to?" he inquired. "He swam out to an island in the bay," the wrestler answered, "to a favoured fishing spot that he is loath to depart without one last visit." "And what of Hedwig? Where has she gone?" The wrestler studied him in bewilderment. "She disappeared into the woods with Iron Beard. But surely you would not entertain the idea of accosting her, even if she appeared in front of you?" Aldrich responded with an unusual grin. "A man who is about to pass away will do many things that would be insane for someone who still has a life ahead of them." He spoke, his eyes staring into his friend's with serious meaning. "I completed the records this morning." "You finished the records this morning?" Halla repeated in disbelief. The other's voice took on a tone of impatience. "I am failing to understand what is so surprising about that. Surely you heard Tove say last night that 100 more words would complete the task, and you yourself determined that Kark would not wait any longer than its fulfillment." Halla struck the tree they were leaning against with sudden force. "The traitor!" he exclaimed. "So that's why he showed his teeth at me this morning with that mocking smile. But how could I have thought that a man of your intelligence would have allowed such a thing to occur? You could have persuaded Tove that there was a myriad of things he failed to remember. You could have prolonged the job." Aldrich shook his head firmly, but quietly. "No, I'm done with lying," he stated. "I won't uphold this deception any longer, not for my life or Hedwig's love. It's become such a suffocating haze around me that I can't see or breathe through the choking folds. But let's cease this conversation, because it's probable that my limbs will have a long rest after tonight. Let's spend today roaming around in search of whatever sport we can find. If I'm unable to spend my final day with the man and the woman I hold most dear, then you, who are next in my heart, will accompany me, yes? Wherever you choose, Halla agreed. They departed just as quietly as they had 2 years prior on that spring morning when they left the Norwegian camp to observe Thorgrim Svensson's horse fight. Today, like then, the atmosphere was golden with spring sunshine, and the entire world seemed alive with the pure joy of living. The chirping of the birds held happiness, and the buzz of the insects contentment. Squirrels were scampering about, always on some delighted task, as groups of them scattered from before the men's feet around every corner. A dewdrop caught in a cobweb gleamed like a precious gem amidst the delicate lacework it adorned. The rustling of quail in the underbrush and the sight of a coiled snake basking in the sun spoke of life in all its glory, a celebration of freedom and joy. They trekked to the hidden nook on the bluff, the greenery enveloping them in their fragrant embrace. They descended to the river, walking miles along its tranquil banks, occasionally stepping aside to revisit a fondly remembered hunt or examine some of the traps they knew were there. But when they discovered a rabbit caught in one of their snares, Aldrich urged Halla to release it, his hand restraining her knife. "Set him free," he ordered gently. "You have no need of him, and his life is his only possession. Let him keep it, for my sake." They didn't watch the little creature scamper away into the ferns. Aldrich felt a twinge of discomfort and hastily walked away. They trudged on for another mile, not saying a word. Mid-morning they came upon a calm stretch of the river where the banks sloped gracefully, trees bending low over the water. The sun beat down mercilessly on them, weighing their bodies down with sweat-drenched clothes. Halla suggested taking a swim to cool off. "Sounds good to me," Aldrich replied, but when the cool water enveloped him, its soft caress a balm on his sticky skin, he was certain it was the best decision they'd made all day. They lounged on the grassy bank afterwards, drowsily relishing the warmth of the sun as they dried off. Aldrich lay there languorously, waiting for Halla to initiate their departure. "This is a peaceful spot," he murmured, gazing up at the sky framed by the branches of the trees. "It makes you feel as if it's so remote no human has ever come this far, and when we've left, no one shall come again." From an anthill he was absent-mindedly poking with blades of grass, Halla glanced up to grin. "Then your emotions can't be trusted, my friend," he remarked, "for there are few spots along the river that our men haven't frequented. Even that lazy thrall will scamper over here most days to have a gander at the quail traps down yonder in the thicket, the one food he'll move for. I only wish he'd visit them today." Aldrich appeared oblivious to his companion's words. His gaze remained fixed on the swaying treetops. "It's a beautiful land to live in," he uttered, wistfully. "Yet I can't help but ponder what it'll be like to be dead here. Doesn't it strike you that when my soul emerges from my tomb at night and finds no one but wolves and bears to howl at, the loneliness will greatly surpass the agony of death? Imagine that. Throughout this entire land, not one human soul. To wander through the groves and the settlements, only to find perpetual emptiness and silence." Without warning, his body stiffened, and he flung his arms up high and clenched his fists in agony. "God Almighty!" he exclaimed. "What have I done to merit such a fate? Why couldn't I have breathed my last when Tove dealt me the fatal blow? Why couldn't I have been laid to rest in a place where human feet would tread over me, and human voices echo in my ears by night?" He flung himself onto his face and remained immobile. Halla rested a hand on his friend's shoulder, and for once his tone was genuinely comforting. "It's difficult to find the correct words, Aldrich, my comrade," he murmured. "You, who have endured so many hardships with bravery, are deserving of a nobler lot. There is only one thing I can offer you. Select whichever man you please, as long as it's not someone with whom I have forged a bond of friendship, and I vow to you that, before we set sail tomorrow, I'll pick a fight with him and slay him, so that, in case of the worst possible scenario, your ghost will possess at least one other to keep you company. He didn't finish his sentence. Out of nowhere, his touch on Aldrich's arm altered into an unyielding grip that hauled the Saxon to his feet. "Behold!" gasped the wrestler as he pulled Aldrich behind the shelter of a great oak tree. "Behold! Are those spectres or fiends?" Half-dazed, Aldrich could only stare in the direction that the wrestler was pointing. On the opposite bank, some 100 yards below their vantage point, stood 2 long-haired, leather-clad men. Another duo had already plunged into the river and were nearly halfway across, and as the white men watched, 4 more creatures burst out from the undergrowth and joined their comrades. "Praise the saint who generously hung leaves upon the trees as thick as curtains," Halla whispered in his comrade's ear. "Up you go for your own sake. and don't make any rustling sound." With the agility of cats, they scampered up the tree trunk, and the foliage kindly hid them. "What is your judgment, ghosts or fiends?" Aldrich inquired when they had both settled on a branching limb and began to spy through gaps in the foliage cover. "It has always been my belief that ghosts are white and devils black, while these creatures seem to be of the shade of bronze." "We shall discover more about them before the end," Halla responded. "The first set is already coming ashore." As he spoke, the two shaggy swimmers scrambled out of the water, dripping like water spaniels, on the very spot where the white men had been lying less than an hour earlier. "I'm happy that we are not lying there now without our garments," Aldrich murmured, and Halla muttered under his breath, "Well, now I'm convinced that I would rather be the only human being in the land than be in company with these creatures, if they are human at all, for by the hammer of Thor they bear more resemblance to dwarfs than to men." Certainly from what could be seen of them through the leaves they were not imposing. Two of their thin arms would not have equated to even one of the wrestlers' magnificent white limbs, and the tallest among them would not have reached above Aldrich's shoulders. The only coverings on their bodies were skins, and the coarseness of their bristling black locks was only comparable to a wild horse's mane. Two of the group had bows and arrows, while the others bore only rough stone hatchets placed in their belts. Their language was a series of grunts and growls that more closely resembled animal sounds than human speech. Halla sneered, "I could easily chase away the whole swarm with just a knife." However, at that moment, one of the individuals raised their face, and Aldrich observed the fierce beast-like mouth and small cunning eyes in the deep sockets. Aldrich raised his eyebrows skeptically. "I'm not certain how that plan would end, though it seems likely we'll have to give it a try if they intend to stay here for the day." Indeed, the stone hatchet men appeared to have settled themselves in for the day. Although one bowman kept guard on the bank, the others lounged on the grass in comfortable positions, engaged in their odd conversation with deep seriousness. "We'll have to stay here all day if we don't do something," Halla whispered to his companion, leaning down from his tree branch. Aldrich did not respond since, at that moment, the harsh voices below stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence of focused attention. In the tree, Aldrich's grey eyes and Halla's blue ones exchanged an uneasy inquiry, answered with pessimistic headshakes. Their whispers couldn't have carried so far or penetrated the noise caused by those voices. It must have been a sound from beyond. They strained their ears, fiercely attentive. It was impossible to miss the sound this time. It rose suddenly, high-pitched and sharp on the tranquil noon air, that of Kark's whistle approaching hastily from the Norse camp. As Aldrich watched with wide eyes, the single word Halla-mouthed was heard. "Kark!" The men below jumped up as soon as they heard the sound, clutching their weaponry. Subsequently, after conversing quietly among themselves, they separated silently like ghosts and disappeared into the foliage, without so much as one rustling of a twig. The little nook, basking in the sun, remained tranquil and lifeless as before. As the whistler approached, Halla brushed his hair aside and settled in to watch with childlike pleasure. "Here is a sport," he exclaimed to his companion. "A chess game where the pieces are not of ivory. I wouldn't have missed this for all the treasure in the world." Halla imagined the look on Kark's face when he realized that his enemies were upon him. He was so obsessed with trying to kill Aldrich of England that he didn't see the pit before him. Fate had brought him to this moment, and Halla was grateful to bear witness to the outcome. Uncertainty flickered across Aldrich's face as he watched the thrall appear among the bushes. "I don't dispute that it seems like the hand of fate," he admitted, "but it's his life or mine." Suddenly a wild yell shattered the moment of tranquility. The lean brown men emerged from the bushes, surrounding the thrall in a silent circle. Despite offering him no harm, the sight of their shriveled bodies and animal-like faces was enough to terrify even the bravest of hearts. Halla couldn't help but smile at the sound of Kark's screams. "He's beginning to distinguish between death-wolves and death-foxes," he observed with amusement. But when he turned to ask his companion what he intended to do, he saw Aldrich preparing to descend and help the thrall. Aldrich may have considered Kark a coward, but he was a fellow human being and deserving of protection. With knife in hand, Aldrich was ready to intervene. Before he could make a move, Halla swung down from the limb above and landed beside him. The boughs creaked loudly under his weight, but Kark's cries covered any noise they might have made. The wrestler spoke with neither drawl nor gentleness. "You are either a child or a foolish man. Do you understand that it is your enemy they are getting rid of? What does it matter to you if he is chopped to pieces? You will not lift a finger to aid him." Aldrich forgot the dagger between his teeth and opened his mouth angrily. The weapon fell to the ground by his feet, making no sound as it hit the soft sod between the roots. The next instant, Halla had wound a scarf from his neck around Aldrich's jaws. One of the wrestler's iron arms wrapped around him, holding him against the broad chest. One of the wrestler's massive hands closed around his wrists like iron fetters, while a muscular leg bent backward over his legs like a steel hoop. Fighting against steel or iron would be no easier. Halla's voice took on a gentle tone again. "I will happily endure your struggles if you wish to exert your strength, comrade, but I tell you, it would be wiser for you to spare yourself. I won't let you go no matter what you do. If you lie quietly, I will let you move so you can see what's happening. It looks like it will become interesting." And it did. The brown men, weary of the howls, began to experiment with changing the tune. They closed in on Aldrich, feeling his clothing and his shaven head, pinching him tentatively with their lean fingers. Though Aldrich's outcries redoubled, Halla remained serene. "See what you're missing by being headstrong," he reproached his captive. "It's rare that men have the opportunity to sit and learn from the experience of another what their fate would have been had their luck been as poor as yours. It is with tremendous fortune that I must admit a certain fear for your lack of gratitude. A divine retribution may be in order for your ungratefulness. By Thor! In a moment of panic, the fool has attacked them. Ah!" From below came a sudden snarl, a sudden savage yell, the noise of struggling bodies, and then a shriek of another kind from Kark, no longer a cry of mere apprehension, but a sharp piercing scream of bodily agony. "Let me go!" Aldrich panted through his muffled jaws. "It is a heinous act for us to permit the death of one of our own. He is a human being. Let me go, Halla." A man made of wood could not have been more relentless than Halla. A man made of stone could hardly have been less affected. "It is true that by some mistake or other Kark wears a human shape," he admitted. "Yet in every other respect he is akin to a dog. Indeed, I think there are few dogs that have less courage and loyalty. Look at the matter sensibly, comrade. If you cannot rejoice in the death of your enemy, at least consider what interest it is to study the habits of dwarves. The worthless cur will be honored by serving a good purpose in his death. Tove will think it of great importance to learn how these creatures react to white men. They have peculiar methods of entertainment. Now they are doing things to his ears." Renewed screams for help and mercy drowned the rest of his words, and called forth fresh exertions from Aldrich. However, when at last the fearless one ceased and lay spent and panting against the brawny chest, he became aware that the cries were growing fainter. "Though they have in no way hastened the matter, I believe that he is almost dead now," Halla comforted his captive. Even as he spoke, the last feeble cry ended in a gurgling choke, and there was silence. Instantly the scarf was slipped from Aldrich's mouth, and the living fetters unclasped themselves from his limbs. "Thanks to me," Halla was beginning. The brief stillness was rudely broken by a cry from the lookout on the riverbank, followed by an echo or an answering call from the opposite side. Halla stretched himself out on the branch, just in time to witness the men below scatter in wild confusion and lurch headlong into the thicket. "In the Troll's name!" he exclaimed. "When dwarfs run like that, giants must be coming." Aldrich scrambled to his feet and stood with his head poking through the leafy ceiling. "It's more of the same breed," he gasped. "They're coming from the other side. Swarms of them there. Some of them have landed." Halla chuckled softly with a sense of quiet satisfaction. "By Thor, what a game!" he exclaimed. "I can see them now. They're pursuing the first group like wolves after sheep. Wait, Kark was the sheep. These are the hunters after the wolves. Hear them howl. The last ones have emerged from the water," Aldrich stooped to report. "Will they also follow? Like dogs pursuing deer. I've never witnessed such a sport. When we can no longer hear them, it will be our turn to run a race." Aldrich offered no response, and they waited in silence. Gradually distance muffled the sharp cries with soft folds, similar to how women dressed swords in cloaks during brawls. Once again, the hum and chirps of nature became audible around them, and the sunshine's smile reappeared in the air. Aldrich realized that nature's peace resembled the wrestler's gentleness. The saying of a wrinkly old nurse of his childhood flashed through his mind. The English die without flinching, the French die with laughs on their lips, but only the Northmen can smile while they kill. When the last muffling shout ended, Halla lowered himself from the branch and hung there for a moment, stretching comfortably and removing the cramps from his limbs. He then descended to the ground, and Aldrich followed suit. The soft lawn lay torn and gashed by their grinding heels. The lengthening shadows revealed a disturbed nook in the centre, where a shapeless thing of white and red rested. Halla gazed down at it with fascination. "It seems clear to me that these individuals derive pleasure from the act of killing itself, going to great lengths to do so," he remarked. "It appears that the thrill of fighting does not bring them joy, but rather the satisfaction of inflicting suffering. I cannot help but wonder if they are truly trolls after all." Aldrich spoke in a rough voice. This was an act of pure evil. He gazed down at the gruesome scene with disgust, and we cannot absolve ourselves of responsibility for allowing it to occur. It does not matter what kind of man he was one of us, a human, and they were monsters. Do not try to tell me that we had no choice," he added with forceful conviction. "If it had been Magnus in that position, we would have taken action or suffered the same fate." Halla sighed and shrugged his shoulders in resignation as they departed. "You can believe whatever you wish," he agreed, "but you cannot deny that you were powerless. Take solace in that fact, at least. If I may speak frankly, Aldrich, your lack of gratitude is astounding. You have rid yourself of your enemy in a time when he was most obstructive, and not only are you free of the burden of his presence, but you also bear no legal consequences." Halla's words halted when he saw the expression on Aldrich's face. It was a mixture of pride, disgust, emotion, and determination. With slow and steady speech, Aldrich declared, "May God have mercy on the soul that gains from this vile act. I would rather endure 100 times more suffering. Halla Vidarson, do not profit from this crime. Would you think that I would live a life built upon the death of another? To scrub my hands clean of this sin, even if it meant severing my wrist, I would do so without hesitation." Chapter 29. The Battle to the Strong. "Happy is he who receives for himself praise and goodwill." These words from Havamal echoed in Arthur's mind as he gazed upon the picturesque scene before him. The Norse camp on the river bluff was bathed in the warm, reddish glow of the sunset, casting a golden hue upon everything in its path. The chief sat under the cover of a sprawling maple tree, watching as two of his fair-haired companions engaged in a rousing tug-of-war on the green before the huts. Onlookers cheered as the hide was stretched back and forth between the two contenders. Hunting and fishing companions watched the proceedings from the sidelines, lounging on the grass and regularly taking swigs from their wine cups. As the Norman and Halla appeared on the edge of the grove, the crowd erupted into a hail of cheers. They had begun to fear the two had been lost. Halla, with his easy manner, accepted their greetings with a flourish. However, the mood soon turned somber as Halla delivered the news that the chief had lost his thrall. As the skin-pullers abandoned their contest and everyone gathered around to hear Halla's tale of adventure, exclamations of amazement and horror erupted from all sides. The chief, Tove, sat silently, a skeptical pucker on his face as he listened to the account. Tove finally spoke up, admitting that he found Halla's story almost unbelievable. The region in question had been traversed daily for over a month, without a single sign of human presence, and yet here was Halla with a tale of a group of strangers in their midst. The reality was difficult to comprehend, but the words of Havamal echoed in Arthur's mind once more. Happy is he who receives praise and goodwill. At this moment, the Norse camp's camaraderie was unbreakable. They appeared like phantoms in a dream, and vanished just as quickly, spoke Halla. But dreams do not leave behind mangled corpses, Tove interjected, his eyes narrowing shrewdly. Halla Vidarson, confess that these beings are nothing more than figments of your imagination. It's clear to everyone that you and your friend did not favor Kark. Confess that it was by your hands that the thrall met his demise. The wrestler's face, typically gentle, hardened. His imposing figure stiffened as he stood taller. Tove Eriksson, when have I ever lied out of love of good or fear of ill? He retorted fiercely. The chief stared at him uncomprehendingly. Do you swear to the truth of your tale? I swear by my knife, by my soul, and by the crucifix on your chest, the wrestler declared. After a brief pause, Tove stood up and shook his hand. In that case, I would believe a story twice as outrageous, he declared candidly. The crowd erupted into applause as their hands met. Meanwhile, Magnus, who had been standing still, rustled his friend's cloak and pleaded with him in hushed tones. Robert Sanspur, the fearless one, broke free and marched forward to stand in front of the bench under the maple tree. Halla tried to block his path, but Robert dodged him and took his position before the bench. The fates seem to be balancing their scales tonight, Chief, he spoke grimly. For the dead man you thought was alive, I present to you a living man you thought was dead. For the thrall you have lost, I present to you another." He wound his hand in his black hair and ripped it out, revealing his own blonde waves. There arose murmurs from both sides, mixed with sounds of disbelief and admiration, accompanied by gruff compliments and muttered requests for mercy. Two people remained silent and still, however. Hedwig kept her promise to remain emotionless, while gazing into her lover's eyes, conveying her courage, loyalty, and love through them. The leader stared fixedly at the once rebel, who had been brought back to life, but betrayed no expression of surprise or any other kind of emotion on his inscrutable face. After a brief pause, Aldrich spoke without faltering. "I chose to conceal my identity as I hoped to aid you and make amends for my wrongdoing. My lack of foresight prevented me from realizing that this could cause more harm than good to my people. This changed after you warned me about the punishment for deceiving you." The leader's face did not change, but he nodded ever so slightly. "At my age, it doesn't sit well for a boy to deceive me, as it's a poor reflection of my intelligence. Even if one does render me the greatest service in the world, they will die if they deceive me." Silence fell upon the assembly like a funeral shroud. Hedwig unsheathed her dagger and ran her finger along its sharp edge, wearing an odd smile on her tight-lipped face. Alwyn, the Earl's son, gasped, and his white face twitched before he regained his composure. He grabbed the knife from his belt and tossed it in front of the leader. With his other hand he tore open his tunic, exposing his chest. "I don't expect mercy," he said proudly. Tove didn't motion to pick up the weapon. Instead, a glint of dry humor shone in his sharp eyes. "No," he responded quietly. "You've asked for nothing of what you should have, and you still haven't asked if you deceived me or not." Hedwig paused, her dagger poised halfway out of its sheath, and looked at him with surprise. "You knew?" she gasped. Tove's lips curled in a wry smile. "I've known the truth since the day Ironbeard disappeared," he said, "and I began to suspect it on the night we set sail from Greenland." He gestured toward the shield maiden with a mixture of mockery and severity. "You gave me little credit, cousin, when you assumed that I wouldn't recognize the signs of love for what they are. Did you think I was deaf to the whisperings of every serving girl in Brattahlid? Or did you believe I was naive enough to think you could love one man in the winter and another in the spring? Even if the Norman had looked nothing like the Englishman, I would have known. But," Hedwig stuttered, "but I thought that you thought Halla said that Magnus—" For perhaps the first time in his life, Tove's face flushed with embarrassment as he snapped his fingers at her. "Magnus? Your childhood friend? The one you fought with and made up with since you were in diapers? By Peter, if the joke weren't so clearly on me, I might be tempted to punish all four of you for daring to question my intelligence." Aldrich took a hesitant step forward. He had been standing rooted to the spot since his first defiant outburst, but now understanding dawned on his face, followed quickly by resentment. "We don't question your anger, Chief," he said slowly. "It's your slowness to act that baffles us. You've known about our deception for some time now, and yet you've said nothing. You let us live in a fantasy world and make fools of ourselves. We've been like mice under the cat's paw." He looked at Hedwig's gaunt cheeks and the pain lines around her eyes, and his voice grew louder with indignation. "To us this meant life or death, heaven or hell. Was it really worth it to you to find amusement in our misery?" Although as faint as the rustling of leaves, unmistakable applause swept around. Halla dared to clap his hands softly. The chief replied with a direct question, leaning back against the maple and scrutinizing his young rebel. "Befooling and bejuggling were the drinks you prepared for me? Was it not just that you should learn from experience how sour a taste they leave in the mouth?" Moment after moment dragged by, but Aldrich did not answer. His eyes fell to the ground, and he stood with head bent and hands clenched. "You who could easily fathom the workings of my mind should have no need to ask my motives," the chief continued. "It may be that I found entertainment in playing you like a fish on a line. Or it may be that I was not sure of my ground and waited to be certain before I acted. Or perhaps I was curious to see what you would do next, knowing that through all your antics I held you securely in the hollow of my hand. Or perhaps—" Tove hesitated for an instant, and there crept into his voice a note so unusual that all stared at him. "Or perhaps, in becoming sure of my ground, I became uncertain of the honor of the man whom I wished to place highest in my friendship, and so deemed it wisest to remain under cover until he should reveal all the hidden parts of his nature. It may have been for any or all of these reasons. You, who have come nearer to me than any man alive, should have no difficulty in selecting the true one." Was it possible that reproach rang in those last words? It sounded so strangely like it. Ironbeard involuntarily curved his hand around his ear to amend some flaw in his hearing. Aldric's face underwent a great change. Suddenly he flung his arms apart in a gesture of utter surrender. "I will strive against you no longer," he cried passionately. "You are as much superior to me as the king to his link boy. Do as you like with me. I submit to you in everything." He fell upon his knee and hid his face in his hands. Then the tone of Tove's voice became so frankly friendly that Hedwig's beautiful head was raised, as a drooping flowers by the soft spring rain. "You have already received your judgment. The kind words I spoke to Robert the Norman were also spoken to Aldric of England. When I promised wealth, friendship, and honour to Robert sans Peur, I made the same promises to you. Take your freedom and dignity, which are befitting of a man of your accomplishments, and ask me for anything except one." With one exception, Hedwig rushed forward and took hold of Tove's hand with a pleading expression on her face. Aldric remained on his knees and took hold of the chief's mantle. "Lord," he exclaimed, "you have been 1,000 times kinder to me than I deserve. But would you grant me one favour, and take back everything else you have promised?" The chief's large hand tenderly touched Hedwig's face. "Do you still think that I would rub salt into your wounds if it were in my power to relieve you?" he reproached them. "Only one man in the world has the right to say where Hedwig shall be given in marriage. Her father, Gilly of Trondhjem. By my careless actions, I have already wronged him by allowing a thrall estate servant to steal his daughter's heart. It is my honour to keep the maiden safe until her father determines her fate. I do not promise that I will not persuade him with the influence I possess, but I must advise you not to expect a favourable outcome. I believe both of you already know how merciless Gilly can be." Chapter 30, From Over the Sea. In the joyful night, the traveller finds entertainment aboard a ship with short yards. Variable is the autumn night, with many changes in the weather to be expected in 5 days, but even more so in a month. These were the words of Havamal, the wise one. As fate would have it, the lovers did not depend on the mercy of Gilly of Trondhjem for happiness. While the exploring vessel was still at sea, with the icy headlands of Greenland only just beginning to stand out clearly before her bow, unexpected tidings reached those on board. Magnus, watching the chief at the steering oar, asked an idle question. "Can you see the drift ice, foster father? And why do you steer so close to the wind?" Tove answered shortly, "I am attending to my steering, foster son." But as Magnus was turning away, the chief added in a tone that betrayed his unwanted interest, "And I am looking at something else. Where are your eyes that you cannot see anything remarkable? Is that a rock or a ship I see straight ahead?" Magnus's curiosity led him to squint under his hand, but he saw nothing more remarkable than a rock. Tove gave a harsh laugh. "See what it is to have young eyes," he said. "Not only can I see that it is a rock, but I can make out that there are men moving around upon it." "Men!" cried Magnus. Excitement spread like fire from stern to bow, until even Hedwig of the Broken Heart arose from her cushions on the foredeck and stood listlessly watching the approach. Eyvind the Icelander muttered that creatures in human shape that dwelt on those rocks must be either another race of dwarfs or such fiends as inhabit the ice wastes with which Greenland is cursed. But an old Greenland sailor silenced him contemptuously. "Ahoy there, landlubber! Have you never heard of shipwrecks before? When Vidar the Black came to Greenland with 35 ships under his command, 4 of them crashed against that very rock. Tova's luck is responsible for the latest shipwreck, so the chief can gain more honour by rescuing the stranded ones." The Icelander grunted. "So, Tove's luck is akin to a sword that brings pride to one man and ruin to another," he retorted. As the chief exerted his strength on the oar, he signalled to Valgar with a nod. "Drop anchor and prepare the boat for lowering," he commanded. "We must sail closer to the wind to reach them. If they are peaceful, we must provide aid. If they are not, we have the upper hand." As the boat set out on its mission, the remaining men and boys huddled together to watch it in action. Coincidentally, Aldric of England was pushed to the very front of the boat, next to the Shield Maiden. When she saw him beside her, the sun shone on her melancholic face. "All day I hoped you would come, my dear. I have an idea that may bring you comfort. I know you have been staring at the sea with a heavy heart, and I ache for you until tears run down my cheeks." Her lover looked at her with longing. "I would gladly trade all of Tove's gifts to take you in my arms and kiss away your tears." Hedwig's eyes glinted with fury. "Before we part," she said through gritted teeth, "you will kiss my eyes for every tear they have shed, and you will kiss my lips 3 times to bid farewell, even if every man in Greenland tries to stop us." With a sudden cry of desperation, she buried her face in his shoulder. "Do not attempt to approach me once I am wed," she whispered. "At the mere sight of your face, I would be compelled to slay my husband." "If only I had not already done so," Aldrich murmured. Then he spoke more steadily. "This talk is unproductive, my dear. Reveal the thought that provided solace to you. It would bring me joy to treasure in my heart what you have stored in your mind." Hedwig gazed out over the cascading water with pensive, widened eyes. "I am hesitant to call it a comfort," she said. "Its shape is still too indistinct. It's a weak concept I've built based on my understanding of Gilly's personality. You, as well as I, are aware that he only values what benefits him. If I were to make myself so unappealing that no leader would have an interest in me, is it not likely that my father would abandon his high regard for me, perhaps even be pleased to be rid of me, and allow you to have me? I would not cause any permanent disfigurements," she assured him hastily. "But if I were to sob until my eyes turned red and my cheeks became pallid, and then cut off my hair eventually, everything would turn out fine. The waiting would not be unbearable, would it?" Aldrich looked upon her with a tinge of amazement. "You would exchange your beauty for plainness, essentially transforming from a queen to a laughing stock, just so that I could attain you? Do you deem it worthwhile to do that for me?" His message was not entirely clear to Hedwig, who grasped solely that he regarded the plan as plausible. Her cheeks flushed with a bloom of hope, much like roses. "Oh, friend, do you genuinely believe this plan could succeed?" she whispered excitedly. "I'd given up on it since everything else has been fruitless. If there is the slightest possibility of success, I shall cut my hair right this moment." Despite his despair, Aldrich emitted a soft chuckle. "Do not believe, my dear, that the golden hair and rosy cheeks alone are what make you beautiful." He posed the question. "It would be easier to change a miser into a philanthropist than to disfigure one such as you. Surely any man who had the privilege of gazing into your eyes and hearing your voice would be willing to give his life for you. Trust not in false admirers, my friend. Also, do not lift your face towards me, for I must act with honor and cannot kiss you, though you are still beautiful, my love." Calls from those around them drew the lovers back to reality. The returning boat was within reach, and many faces of unfamiliar people peered up, while a woman lay inert in the front of the boat. Although the woman looked small, disheveled, and in bad shape, her features were still considered pretty. Hedwig's frustration was overshadowed with empathy, and she momentarily forgot her desires. "Bring her to me and lay her down on my cushions," instructed the shield maiden to the men carrying the woman on board. Wrapping the injured woman in her own cloak, she removed her wet clothing where she could, gave her drink, and worked hard to get some heat back into her frozen limbs. The boat headed back to collect the remaining few from the wreckage. The people who had been rescued explained the story of the shipwreck. They sailed from Nidaros to Greenland with lumber, but their ship hit a submerged reef and was shattered. Luckily, they reached an inhospitable rock where they clung like flies, freezing, battered by the winds, and drenched. The waves, however, in a moment of kindness, did throw back some of the timber, which served as their only shelter. In terms of food, they managed with nothing more than rough lichens and a few birds' eggs. It wasn't surprising that upon Tov's arrival, the emaciated people found hope and comfort, and were grateful for the salvation from their near-death state. "It appears that our fate is one of luck and good," proclaimed Thorir on the forecastle, watching as the anchor and sail rose with joyful alacrity. "Without your aid, we could not have lasted a single day longer." Gudrid, just waking to see a fair face offering a wine-cup, barely murmured, "You look as beautiful to me as a Valkyria. What is your name, so that I may know the name of my saviour?" "I am called Hedwig, daughter of Gilly," the shield maiden replied, with a bitter edge creeping into her voice. Gudrid's eyes widened in wonder and alarm. "Not Hedwig the fair of Trondhjem," she gasped, "who fled from Gilly to his kinsfolk in Greenland? My dear unfortunate child." With clasped hands that let her wine-cup fall to the ground, Hedwig begged, "Is he dead? Only tell me, and I'll serve you the rest of my life. Is Gilly dead?" But Gudrid had fallen into another faint. Tove, biting at his moustache, turned to Thorir, demanding to know the story, his kinswoman's tale that was being held back. "Is Gilly of Trondhjem dead?" Thorir's reply was quick and courteous. "No, nothing so severe, nothing that cannot be easily fixed. It appears that when Gilly followed his daughter to Greenland last fall, he suffered a shipwreck and lost much valuable property, barely escaping with his life. From this he rashly concluded that his daughter was a misfortune, as if some foreknowing woman had predicted it. He declared that since she had preferred her poorer kinsfolk in Greenland, she could stay with them, and before he could finish, Hedwig rapturously interrupted, "And he disowned me?" Thorir stared at her in amazement, pitying her as he said, "Yes." It was a good thing he didn't try to give a longer response, as he would never have been able to complete it. Suddenly madness took hold of the ship. Even with her disinheritance, the shield maiden was beaming. In the hold of the ship, 2 young men who heard the words threw up their hats and cheered. Tove Eriksson himself laughed heartily and snapped his fingers in contempt. "A powerful revenge!" he exclaimed. "My relative could not have received a greater kindness from the peasant. If she could have done it with a dagger, I've no doubt she would have let his dirty blood flow from her veins long ago." He turned to where Hedwig was watching, her heart in her eyes, and took her hand to kiss her. "You chose between honor and wealth, dear relative," he said, "but as long as I have a ring in my pocket, you will never be without land. You have behaved like a true Norsewoman, and I must say that I respect you for it. Go where your heart leads you without any more obstacles." Hedwig stayed to press his hand against her cheek. Then, without a hint of shame, she walked toward the path that would lead her to her lover's waiting arms. They stood together on the gilded prow while he kissed her eyes 2 times for each tear she had shed. Then he kissed her mouth 9 times. Not a single person in the world dared to stop him. Together they stood on the flying bow, appearing like a divinely carved figurehead, illuminated by the light of love. Conclusion. As the final rays of the sun melted from atop the mountains, the exploration vessel dropped anchor before Eric's shipsheds. At the first visible signal, eager groups assembled on the beach to be present for this grand occasion. Not just loiterers, but even the Red One himself, Thorwald and every soul from Brattahlid, together with half the aristocratic men of Greenland who had stayed by Eric's hospitality for the past month. They jostled and pushed each other as if they were schoolboys, rushing down energetically to greet the first group from the boat. The 10 sailors who disembarked on shore looked healthy and well-fed. They held in their arms a bunch of odd pets, bags packed with samples of wheat and timber, raisins and nuts. They appeared jubilant, content with eating well for a year, and content with their importance. While they were hugging their sweethearts, they began bragging about their intrepid adventures and boasting about the grains, timber, and wine. The locals heard enough to get wickedly curious and thirsty for more dainty details, and every following set of muscular heroes worked up their spirits to a higher level of excitement. Gradually the tune went to the sad minor key, as Thorir's wretched crew landed on the beach. Pale, weary, and barely capable of walking, they clung feebly to the strong arms of their saviours, and the wretchedness of their starving existence was apparent, etched onto Gudrid's fair white face. The cheerfulness and chuckling shifted into pitiful and inquisitive murmurs. As Thorir quickly told the Red One of their sufferings, the throng listened intently, as they did with their favourite ballad. They felt shaken and emotional. Then, in terms that still resounded with joy and thankfulness, Thorir recounted their deliverance by Tove Eriksson. Swiftly shooting arrows just need to be pointed to make them successful. Flights of the wildest elation had been propelling them forward from all corners. Now, Thorir gave them a discernible objective. Interest and triumph, shame and rejoicing all fused into a grand impulse and grew into an enthusiasm of hero worship. They switched their faces and hearts to face the boat carrying the lucky one, and worshipped enthusiastically before him. The glaciers of Greenland never heard such a clamour of acclamation as the throng cheered and beat their weapons in unison. It was a moment of supreme magnitude. Tove's tanned visage turned pale as he waited for the commotion to abate so he could respond. Nevertheless, his composure did not falter when he finally stepped forward to address the crowd. "I am deeply grateful for your kindness, my friends," he expressed cordially. "It exceeds my expectations, and I thank you. Nevertheless, I must remind you that I do not put my faith solely in my own abilities. What I have achieved has been possible through the aid of my God, whom you have rejected. To him I attribute all honor and praise." In reverence that transcended vanity, he lifted the silver crucifix from his chest and bowed his head before it. Following the ensuing stillness, the voice of one of Greenland's most distinguished chieftains echoed loud and clear. "Hail the god of Tove Eriksson! The god that assisted him must be omnipotent. From this moment on I acknowledge that he, and no one else, is the sole god. Hail the cross!" Before he was done, other voices joined in, and then more, until nearly every man was shouting the same ecstatic refrain over and again. Eric turned his head away and gestured a hammer sign across his chest in reverence to Thor. Nevertheless, his face spoke only of pride when he turned it back. Tove remained still amidst the clamour, gazing upwards with that peculiar, far-off expression, as if his eyes yearned to penetrate the clouds shrouding the walls of Valhalla and search for one treasured face among the warriors gathered on the benches. Beneath his breath, he murmured to his English attendant, "May Olaf Tryggvason hear this, and know that I have been as unswerving in death as I was in life." He did not perceive when Aldrich bowed and reverently kissed the hem of his red cloak. Neither did he overhear the heartfelt whisper, "I shall remain as faithful to you as you have been to him, now and forever." The end. This concludes The Thrall's Redemption, Viking Historical Fiction, written by Bjorn Wolfe, narrated by R.K. Marks. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.